A cargo ship disappeared off Greenland's coast in February 2023. No distress call, no warning, just vanished into winter seas that turned deadly in under 12 minutes. The crew of 18 never stood a chance against what maritime experts call the most dangerous navigational waters on the planet. And here is the terrifying part. Conditions are getting worse every single year. Greenland Maritime alert zones now cover 70% more coastline than a decade ago. And the reason why reveals something about our changing Arctic that almost nobody is talking about. You probably think Greenland's shipping dangers come from icebergs. That is what everyone assumes. Titanic syndrome. But the real killer is something far more unpredictable, far more violent, and infinitely harder to escape. By the end of this video, you will understand why even the most experienced Arctic captains now refuse certain routes, why insurance companies are pulling coverage from entire regions, and why what happens in Greenland's coastal waters will determine the future of global shipping in ways that go far beyond ice and weather. Here is what makes Greenland's winter seas uniquely lethal. Unlike the relatively predictable dangers of Antarctica or the Canadian Arctic, Greenland sits at the collision point of three major ocean systems. The cold East Greenland Current flows south, carrying pack ice from the Arctic Ocean. The warm Erminger Current pushes north from the Atlantic. And the West Greenland Current creates a third dynamic along the opposite coast. These three systems do not mix peacefully. They create what oceanographers call hydraulic chaos zones, where water temperature can drop 15 degrees Celsius in less than 3 kilometers of distance. Now imagine trying to navigate a 15,000-ton cargo vessel through that. The winter amplifies everything. From November through April, Greenland experiences what locals call the dark season, when daylight shrinks to barely 4 hours and storms roll in with almost no warning. Wind speeds regularly exceed 100 kilometers per hour. Wave heights reach 12 to 15 meters. But here is where it gets worse. Those massive waves are not hitting stable water. They are slamming into a constantly shifting battlefield of ice chunks, some the size of houses, others the size of city blocks, all grinding against each other in the current. When a wave hits that ice, it does not dissipate energy gradually like waves hitting open ocean. It rebounds, creates standing waves, generates what mariners describe as washing machine conditions, where water comes from every direction simultaneously. Ships cannot handle that. Modern vessels are built to handle waves from predictable angles. Their stabilization systems work when water behaves according to physics models. But in Greenland's coastal ice zones during winter storms, physics gets weird. Captains report waves appearing from 45-degree angles that should be impossible based on wind direction. They describe ice flows accelerating against the current, pushed by underwater shelf formations that redirect flow in counterintuitive ways. Several maritime incident reports mention the same phrase: the ocean stopped making sense. And in a moment you will see why the ice itself has become the biggest betrayal of all. But first, we need to understand just how many ships are gambling with these conditions every single week. Greenland is not some remote backwater where only research vessels venture. Over 2,000 commercial voyages navigate Greenland waters annually, carrying everything from mining equipment to consumer goods for the 56,000 people living in coastal settlements. Towns like Nuuk, Ilulissat, and Sisimiut depend entirely on maritime supply chains. No roads connect these places. No rail lines. Everything arrives by ship or does not arrive at all. The mining boom makes it worse. Rare earth elements, zinc, lead, gold, and potentially massive rare earth deposits are drawing extraction companies to Greenland like nowhere else on the planet. These mining operations require enormous cargo ships carrying industrial equipment, fuel, and personnel. They cannot wait for perfect weather windows. Contracts have deadlines. Investors demand production schedules. So ships sail in marginal conditions, betting they can make it through before the next storm system arrives. Sometimes they are right, sometimes they are not. The statistics show a disturbing trend. Maritime incidents in Greenland waters increased 47% between 2015 and 2023, with winter months accounting for 82% of serious events. Now, here is the part that changes everything, the element that transforms difficult navigation into genuinely life-threatening scenarios. The coastal ice is lying to you. For centuries, Arctic mariners developed expertise reading ice formations. Experienced captains could look at pack ice and determine its thickness, stability, and safety margin for passage. That knowledge is now dangerously obsolete. Climate data reveals that Greenland's coastal ice has fundamentally changed character over the past 20 years. What appears solid from the surface is often honeycomb structure underneath, riddled with melt channels and weak points that collapse without warning. This creates a nightmare scenario called ice fragmentation events. Imagine a ship carefully navigating what appears to be stable coastal ice, using it as a windbreak against open ocean swells. Suddenly, that ice shatters into thousands of pieces, each one now a projectile driven by wind and current. Ships have minutes to escape before they are surrounded by grinding ice chunks that can pierce hulls, damage propellers, or trap vessels in positions where rescue becomes impossible. The fragmentation happens so fast that even satellite monitoring cannot provide adequate warning. By the time imagery updates show the breakup, conditions on the water have already become critical. And here is the disturbing truth. Scientists are not entirely certain why fragmentation events are increasing. Yes, overall warming plays a role, but the pattern does not match simple temperature rise. Some of the worst fragmentation events occurred during relatively cold winters. Research suggests the problem might be structural changes in how ice forms in the first place. Warmer autumn temperatures mean ice develops differently, with less uniform crystalline structure and more vulnerability to stress fractures. By the time winter cold sets in, the ice looks solid, but contains invisible fault lines throughout its mass. Then one strong wave, one pressure shift, one temperature fluctuation triggers catastrophic failure. Unstable coastal ice creates another danger that few people outside the maritime industry understand. Navigation instruments become unreliable. Modern ships depend on GPS, radar, and sonar to build real-time maps of their surroundings. But ice fragments scatter radar signals in chaotic patterns. Sonar bounces off ice chunks floating at different depths, creating ghost images that captains mistake for solid obstacles. GPS remains accurate for position, but it cannot tell you whether the water ahead is navigable or filled with hidden ice daggers waiting to rip open your hull. Captains are forced to rely on visual navigation in conditions with 4 hours of twilight and frequent whiteout snow squalls. It is flying blind at 15 knots through a minefield. Now, you might be wondering, why do not ships just avoid Greenland altogether? Route around it? Take safer passages. Here is where global shipping economics collide with Arctic reality, and the answer reveals why this problem will only intensify. Greenland sits along some of the most valuable shipping routes on the planet. The Arctic Shipping Corridor, which cuts travel time between Europe and Asia by approximately 5,000 kilometers compared to the Suez Canal route, passes directly along Greenland's coast. As Arctic ice recedes, shipping companies are under enormous pressure to exploit these shorter routes. Time is money. Fuel is money. Every day saved on a trans-Arctic voyage translates to millions in cost savings and competitive advantage. But the shortcut runs straight through the danger zone. The irony is brutal. Climate change is simultaneously opening new Arctic routes and making them more treacherous to navigate. Less ice overall sounds good for shipping until you realize that unstable, fragmenting ice is far more dangerous than stable pack ice ever was. You can navigate around a solid ice shelf. You cannot navigate around an unpredictable field of disintegrating ice chunks that reform and break apart based on current, wind, and wave action you cannot predict. The economic pressure creates moral hazard. Shipping companies know the risks. Insurance underwriters definitely know the risks, which is why premiums for Greenland coastal routes have increased 300% since 2020. But the profit potential from shorter Arctic routes is so substantial that companies accept the risk, factor the insurance cost into their business model, and sail anyway, until something goes catastrophically wrong. Then we get international incidents, environmental disasters from fuel spills, and loss of life that triggers investigations and regulatory debates that change nothing fundamental about the underlying equation. And in just a moment, you will discover the military dimension that makes Greenland's maritime situation even more complex. But first understand this. Rough winter seas and unstable ice are not just shipping industry problems. They affect everything about how Greenland functions as a society. Those 56,000 residents scattered across coastal settlements depend on maritime supply for survival. When ships cannot safely reach communities for weeks at a time due to ice conditions and storms, people run short of fuel, food, medical supplies, and essential goods. Isolated settlements have reported going 6 weeks beyond scheduled resupply missions because captains deemed conditions too dangerous to attempt landing. This creates political tension. Greenland is pushing for greater autonomy from Denmark, with some factions advocating for full independence. But independence requires economic self-sufficiency, which depends heavily on resource extraction and reliable maritime trade. Unstable coastal ice threatens that entire vision. How do you build an independent economy when your ports are inaccessible 20% of the year and rising? How do you attract mining investment when companies cannot guarantee they can ship ore out on schedule? The ice does not care about political aspirations. Denmark, meanwhile, faces its own strategic calculations. Maintaining Greenland as part of the Danish realm costs Copenhagen approximately 600 million euros annually in subsidies and support. That is a massive expenditure for a nation of fewer than 6 million people. But losing Greenland means losing claim to vast Arctic territories and potential resources worth trillions. It also means losing strategic military position in an increasingly contested Arctic region. So Denmark invests in icebreakers, search and rescue capabilities, and maritime infrastructure, all while knowing that climate-driven ice instability is making that investment less effective each year. Now, here is where it gets geopolitically wild. The United States maintains Thule Air Base in northwest Greenland, one of the most important early warning and space surveillance installations in the entire Western Defense Network. That base depends entirely on maritime resupply for everything that cannot be flown in, which is most heavy equipment and bulk supplies. When winter ice conditions deteriorate, American military logistics face the same challenges as commercial shipping. Except failure for a military base creates national security implications. The Pentagon has funded studies on Arctic maritime navigation specifically to address vulnerabilities in the Greenland supply chain. Those studies reached uncomfortable conclusions about how climate change is actually reducing Arctic maritime reliability in the short term, even as it opens long-term possibilities. Then you have China, which declared itself a near-Arctic state despite being approximately 3,000 kilometers from the Arctic Circle. Chinese shipping companies are exploring Arctic routes aggressively, and Chinese mining firms are circling Greenland's rare earth deposits like sharks. Beijing understands that whoever controls reliable Arctic navigation in the coming decades controls enormous economic and strategic advantage. But China has limited Arctic maritime experience, especially in Greenland's uniquely challenging coastal ice conditions. Several Chinese vessels have required rescue assistance after encountering ice situations they catastrophically misjudged. That inexperience plus ambitious expansion equals high probability of major maritime disasters in coming years. Russia, meanwhile, has the opposite problem. Extensive Arctic experience, but deteriorating infrastructure and limited resources to maintain it. Russian icebreakers are among the most capable in the world, but the fleet is aging and replacement costs are astronomical. Moscow watches nervously as Greenland becomes an increasingly important maritime choke point for Arctic access, knowing they lack the diplomatic capital to influence Greenland policy the way they might have decades ago. This creates strange bedfellows. Russian maritime expertise versus Chinese investment money versus American strategic interest versus European environmental concerns, all playing out in Greenland's coastal waters, while the ice continues doing whatever it wants, regardless of human plans. Here is the environmental twist that makes everything more complicated. Maritime traffic in Greenland waters produces significant pollution, from fuel spills to ballast water discharge to simple engine emissions. Environmentalists rightfully point out that the same climate change opening Arctic routes is also destroying fragile ecosystems, and increasing ship traffic accelerates that damage. But Greenland communities are caught in the middle. They need economic development. They need reliable supply chains. They need the revenue from mining and shipping. Telling them to sacrifice development for environmental protection sounds noble from Europe or America, but rings hollow when you are living in a settlement running low on heating fuel in February, with supply ships unable to reach you because of unstable ice. The next decade will determine whether technology can solve Greenland's maritime challenge, or whether we are headed for catastrophic failures that reshape Arctic policy. Several promising innovations are under development. Advanced ice radar systems that can penetrate surface appearance and assess structural stability. Drone swarms that provide real-time aerial reconnaissance of ice conditions ahead of vessels. AI prediction models that synthesize satellite data, weather patterns, current information, and historical ice behavior to forecast fragmentation events. Some shipping companies are investing in specialized ice-class vessels with reinforced hulls and unusual hull shapes designed to handle fragmenting ice better than conventional designs. But technology always lags behind need. The ships we build today were designed for ice conditions that no longer exist. The prediction models are trained on historical data that no longer applies because the ice is changing faster than our understanding evolves. Every winter brings ice behavior that surprises even veteran Arctic researchers. How do you engineer solutions for a problem that keeps rewriting its own rules? Insurance companies are voting with their actuarial tables. Premiums rise. Coverage exclusions expand. Several major underwriters now refuse to cover certain Greenland routes entirely during winter months, regardless of price. That should tell you something about how seriously the industry takes this threat. Insurance companies are not in the business of turning down revenue unless the risk genuinely terrifies them. When they walk away from coverage, they are saying the odds of catastrophic loss are too high to calculate, let alone insure against. So, what does all this mean for you, even if you never plan to go near Greenland? It means the smartphone in your pocket probably contains rare earth elements that traveled through those dangerous waters. It means the global supply chain you depend on for everything from electronics to construction materials to renewable energy technology is vulnerable to disruptions you never think about. When ships cannot navigate Greenland's coast safely, mining operations slow down. When mining slows down, rare earth supplies tighten. When supplies tighten, prices increase and production delays cascade through industries worldwide. That electric vehicle you are waiting for might be delayed because the motor magnets depend on neodymium that could not ship out of Greenland on schedule. It means the Arctic is not some distant frontier anymore. It is becoming a central arena for economic competition, environmental crisis, and geopolitical maneuvering, with Greenland's unstable coastal ice acting as wild card that nobody can control. You think you understand climate change as an abstract concept of rising temperatures and melting glaciers, but the reality is far more immediate and chaotic. Ice that lies about its stability, seas that turn violent without warning, and critical shipping routes that work perfectly until they catastrophically do not. The Greenland Maritime Alert is not just about ships and ice. It is about what happens when the natural world changes faster than human systems can adapt. It is about the gap between technological capability and environmental volatility widening instead of narrowing. It is about millions of tiny decisions, every cargo shipment, every mining contract, every settlement resupply mission, adding up to systemic vulnerability that we pretend is manageable right up until it is not. And when that system fails, when we get the big disaster that everyone saw coming but nobody prevented, it will reshape how we think about Arctic sovereignty, climate adaptation, and the price we pay for pretending the Earth will cooperate with our economic plans? Greenland's rough winter seas and unstable coastal ice are not anomalies. They are the future arriving ahead of schedule, and we are navigating it about as well as that cargo ship that vanished in 12 minutes flat. If you found this deep dive into Arctic maritime reality valuable, consider subscribing for more content that explores the geography most people never think about until it disrupts their entire world. Drop a comment with your answer to this question. Should shipping companies be allowed to navigate dangerous Arctic routes if it means cheaper goods, but higher environmental and human risk? And check the description for links to maritime incident reports and climate studies that document everything we have covered here. The ice keeps changing. The question is whether we change fast enough to survive what it becomes.